Mate 40 here. So, one anomalous thing that dominated the news with regard to the Hamas attacks on Israel, that is the role of Iran. Now, I'm not a geopolitical expert, no Middle East expert, but the emphasis on Iran seems wildly out of proportion with reality. Like, Hamas is not a proxy for Iran. Why is there such a desire in the news media to attribute Hamas's attack on Israel to Iran? Why doesn't much of the news media want to regard Hamas as just a pawn, the plaything, the puppet of Iran? Like, it's not true. Hamas has its own incentives, its own desperate need to lash out at Israel, make itself relevant and powerful and enhance its status, or at least give itself meaning. But the media is dominated by talk of Iran, completely out of proportion to Iran's role in the Hamas attacks. I mean, it's a little bit like how the Bush administration and the media became obsessed with Iraq after the 9/11 attacks. Now, Iraq had nothing to do with the 9/11 attacks. You can't say that Iran had nothing to do with the Hamas attacks, but Hamas is no proxy for Iran. And so the Wall Street Journal had a report that, Iran signed off on these attacks and Iran was directing and funding the attacks. But both the United States and Israel said there's no evidence for this. And it goes completely against the trend of Iranian behavior, right? They reached a deal with the Biden administration to free about 6 Americans. They're opening up their uranium enrichment to international inspectors, right? They're open to dialogue with America in overseen by the nation of Oman. And Hamas attack on Israel was not primarily as an Iranian proxy. Now, Hezbollah is substantially an arm of Iran, but Hamas is its own thing, its own entity. It's not just a puppet of Iran, but much of the media and Republicans are just seizing on this, particularly Fox News and Republicans. Right? This Hamas attack on Israel had absolutely nothing to do with the Biden administration unfreezing $6 billion in Iranian assets, right? That's Iranian money that the Biden administration simply unfroze, right? And none of those funds are now available. There's just no evidence that had anything to do with the Hamas attacks. So I can understand why Republicans are trying to blame the Hamas attack on Joe Biden, because they see it as a useful stick to hit the Biden administration with. But there's just no evidence that Iran is a key player in this Hamas attack. You can find at least as much evidence, if not more, that Moscow and Russia are key players in this Hamas attack. But still, Hamas has agency, right? Hamas did this. Hamas had their own incentives for acting. Like, the Gaza Strip is a pretty miserable place, and Hamas has seemed increasingly irrelevant, and they were desperate to stand up against the hated Zionist enemy. It's just weird how much news media and talking heads want to go on and on about Iran. Right? There is considerable knee-jerk anti-Iranian tendencies in the news media and in politics, and I guess in the American people. Like, it's a trope. It's a loathing in the American people that the commentators and activists can use, but it's far removed from reality. And we really don't want to be going to war unnecessarily with Iran. I'm sure that they have kill squads in the United States that they could activate Now, Iran has refrained from carrying out any terror against American citizens in America, and I don't believe they've done so in Europe either. Right? They have exercised a great deal of inhibition in this regard. Yeah, they've killed Americans in Iraq, but Iraq is right next to Iran, and Iran has overwhelming incentives to control Iraq, which they substantially have. And it was American idiocy that got us so deeply involved in Iraq. And then the other anomaly that just jumps out at me in the news media coverage about Hamas is all the talk about intelligence failure. And the track record of talk of intelligence failure whenever anything happens like this is that it never stands up. Like on 9/11, we had intelligence reports, prior to 9/11, that something like this was coming. And you're going to find in Israel that there were all sorts of intelligence reports saying that something like this was coming, and people in power chose to ignore these reports. So this is a political and military failure in Israel. It's not primarily an intelligence failure, but that's what's dominating the news, I guess. Why? Because it suits people in power to distract from what really happened, to blame intelligence and to blame Iran. And I would wager to you that Iran did not play a major role in these attacks, because that would be completely anomalous compared to the direction of their choices over the last few months. And I would wager to you that there were considerable Israeli intelligence reports suggesting that Hamas was planning an attack, and people in power who are now desperate to launder their reputations, trying to blame this on intelligence failure. But I'm no world expert on intelligence, but everything we know about the track record of so-called intelligence failures doesn't stand up. You have intelligence reports, and it's people in power who chose to ignore intelligence reports about bad things coming down the pike for their own reasons. And almost no attention is being paid to the significant incentives for Russia to be involved or to encourage these attacks, because the media is so on board with arming and supporting Ukraine. But if the US had not been so heavily involved in supporting Ukraine, Russia would not have been incentivized to create these proxy wars to trouble the United States and put stress on its munitions and supplies. So this attack is going to take all sorts of munitions and supplies that would otherwise go to Ukraine, instead of going to be directed towards Israel. And this would be an amazing time for China to attack Taiwan, because the US is now stretched thin. And neither Israel nor Ukraine is important to US strategic interests. So at some point you'd expect US strategic interests to dominate American strategy making, even above the power of various lobbies that want to militate against American basic interests. How reasonable and responsible is the whole goal preventing Iran from obtaining nuclear weaponry? Totally reasonable and responsible for Israel to do this. Totally reasonable and responsible for Iran to pursue nuclear weaponry. Iran has the capability right now of going nuclear. So I think the Obama administration did the best they could with this difficult situation, but due to American actions such as invading Iraq, invading Afghanistan, right, Iran was strongly incentivized to reasonably and responsibly pursue nuclear weapons. I don't believe that the leaders of Iran are irrational. Right? To me, they make overwhelming rational decisions, including the pursuit of nuclear arms. I do believe that they can be negotiated with, bargained with, that they are rational actors. But much of their rhetoric about destroying the Jewish state is about destroying Israel as a Jewish state. It's not necessarily about annihilating every Jew there. Now, Jewish state certainly has reasons to be wary of Iran, but as far as going into Gaza, right, an unlimited war in Gaza may very well bring in Hezbollah, which is not necessarily in Israel's best interest, in that if Hezbollah wanted to, they could kill 10,000 Israelis in one day. Right? They could flatten much of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv with their rockets. They could destroy Israel as we currently know it. And Hezbollah is 5 times the fighting force that Hamas is. And we saw the enormous amount of damage. And Israeli reserves, not crack troops. Right? Israel always starts its war slowly. Its reserves are not crack. They're not superb. They're not a finely honed fighting force. So, yeah, the survival Jewish state is at issue because if Hezbollah attacks, it will be devastating. And then the United States may need to follow its strategic interests, which would mean prioritizing defense of Taiwan, not supplying Ukraine or Israel. How credible for any actors overwhelmingly pro-Israel's U.S. to claim moral indignation at the idea of nuclear weaponizer? Well, you give different messages to different people. So one thing I noticed talking about the events in Hamas and Israel is that ordinary people have no say over U.S. foreign policy. It is decided by elites. It's not really decided by democratic processes. There's virtually no difference in substance between Republican, Democratic Party foreign policy. It's already decided by elites that we'll go to war to protect Iran. Moral talk about Iran getting nuclear weapons. All right, I guess that's a partisan political talking point. But in reality, these things are decided without regard for morality. To be continued.